Prime Minister has called a general election for the 4th of July. The 2024 general election campaign is now on. Here's what you need to know. We are, 6 weeks away from polling day? The polls have barely shifted over the past year and a bit, so why call it now? Why would you feel emboldened to call a general election over inflation figures? The rate of inflation has fallen, yes, but is that enough? Few people are feeling the relative so-called recovery in the cost of living. Few people are feeling the numbers we see on the screen. It sounds like 1992 in America all over again, while George H.W. Bush pointed to all these GDP figures, job figures, and so on and so forth. Bill Clinton read the room and said, well, it's the economy. It's people's livelihoods. It's the cost of living. That seems to be the divide between the Conservatives and Labour. A government that is pointing to figures and an opposition that isn't, and is instead going hard on feelings, what people feel. So, I'm going to use this video just to quickly brief through what you need to know as we are around 6 weeks away from polling day, the 4th of July, the 2024 general election. It's on its way. So let's go here to the actual headline numbers. Labour's lead right now is 20-something percentage points. You look at that, okay? As of the 19th of May, as of a few days ago, the last poll with field work starting on the 19th of May, Labour is on 44%, up 12 points. The Conservatives are on 23%, down 20 points. That would represent the biggest collapse in support for a governing party, I think, perhaps in our country's at least modern history, at least in modern democracy. The Liberal Democrats are on 10%. They are down 2 points, but note that in general elections it is a little bit hard. The Lib Dem, share of support does get understated by a little bit, and in parts of the country in which they have strength, the opinion polls do show some of their support going Labour instead of them. I wouldn't place much truck in that. I would just say support for the Lib Dems is as it was in the 2019 general election. The Reform Party have indeed surged, according to the opinion pollsters, into third place. They are on 12%, not too far from where UKIP were in 2015, but it doesn't feel like 2015 for a party of the radical right, does it? They're up only 10 points. Only? Well, significant rise. They're up 10 points on where the Brexit Party was in 2019, but note the strength of the Brexit Party, and indeed the strength of UKIP, isn't one-to-one the same as where Reform support presently lies now. It's similar, but it's not one-to-one. Something to keep in mind there. And indeed, support for the Greens are on 6%. They are above 1 in 20 people going their way. They're up 3.6 points on the 2019 election. This would represent the best performance for a Green Party across the UK since the 1980s European elections, in which the then Ecology Party, or was it called Green Party, polled a few million votes in the European parliamentary elections. This is a big shift on where we were in 2019. And if you go back to the start of the polls, the start of the year in 2020, just before COVID hit, the Conservatives were on 49%, Labour on 30%. Very little change in support for Labour. As soon as Keir Starmer became leader, the party's support for Labour did gradually improve, and by about June, following the resignation of Dominic Cummings, following all that chaos, the polls began to narrow, but still the Conservatives had a stubborn lead. By the time we were looking at lockdowns, those tiered lockdowns, remember all that? The polls had narrowed to virtually neck and neck, at least in terms of party popularity. By the time the vaccine was pushed out, by the time Boris Johnson got that Brexit deal through, by the time the UK officially left the European Union, the Conservatives did gain a substantial lead. By the time of the local elections, the Tory lead was virtually what it was in 2019. And then we had the Batley and Spen by-election that Labour clung on by only a few hundred votes. And that was really, perhaps the worst possible time for Keir Starmer. Allegedly, it was this period when Labour was 10 points behind and almost losing the Batley and Spen by-election when Keir Starmer considered his position and considered resigning. But it was not to be. The Owen Paterson affair, Partygate, and a whole host of other issues dragged the Tory share of support down, and by December 2021, Labour eked out a very slim lead. By January and February 2022, Labour had a 2-point lead, not much to go there, well within the margin of error, and by the local elections, Labour's lead was more up to 6 percentage points. By the time of the Wakefield by-election, which represented the first Labour gain from the Conservatives in a by-election since 2012, 10 years there, Labour's lead was more 7 to 8 points. And then eventually, Partygate took over, consumed the politics of then, and the resignation of Boris Johnson. Johnson resigned at a time when Labour's lead was 8 percentage points. And then Liz Truss came in. And look what happened there. By the middle to end of October, Labour was polling in excess of 50% of voters with an opinion. Note what you're looking at here. This is of voters who are determined, certain to vote. When you see Tory collapse, sometimes it is voters moving to another party, but also it is voters leaving the voting process altogether. What happened during the short era of Liz Truss, was a number of 2019 Tory voters saying they were going to stay at home. So then Liz Truss fell and Rishi Sunak came into the top job. And Sunak ascended to Downing Street, came into number 10 when his party was polling 26% of the vote. Labour were on 48%. Support for reform was only 5%. Since then, the polls have moved a little bit. Labour's lead has got as low as 17 percentage points, 16 percentage points here, 15 as of June last year, but it did bob along to a comfortable 15 to 20 points. By the time of the 2024 local elections, Labour's lead was comfortably 20 to 21%, and note 21 points rather, and by the time of Rishi Sunak calling the snap general election, the 4th of July general election, the Conservatives were on 23%, lower than the numbers recorded under Liz Truss, and Labour are on 44%. Note, when you compare to the era of Liz Truss, the slightly higher numbers for the Greens and the more than double share of support for reform. But that's not all, because you've got to be looking at other things as well. Let's look at Labour's lead, not just over party popularity, but other such issues. As of the 19th of May, Labour's lead was 21 points on party popularity. This is the horse race stakes. But what about the economy? Labour's lead is at 13 points. The best, by the way, the best they've ever had since around about 2001, 2002. Keir Starmer's lead over Rishi Sunak in terms of likeability is 11 points. And Keir Starmer's own lead of likeability over the number of Britons who don't like him is around 1 to 2 percentage points. So Starmer in isolation isn't much of an impressive figure, but Starmer when compared to Sunak very much impresses. And Labour when compared to the Conservatives on party popularity, they blow the Conservatives out of the water. Labour's lead over the Conservatives on the economy is substantial and very comfortable indeed. When you look at that, party popularity and party lead on the economy, Labour being either 21 points ahead or 13 points ahead, I think you can say with some certainty that the final lead as of the general election campaign on the 4th of July will be between a Labour lead of 13 points and 21 points. We don't really know. Will it become incredibly presidential? Will Starmer's rather weak approval ratings catch up with him and drag the Labour lead down? Or will it be more about brand? Some polling I've seen does seem to indicate that it is rather Tory v Labour as opposed to Sunak versus Starmer and hope over fear and other such things. Now, this is of the whole of the country. And if an election was held now, we should expect Labour to pull away with more than 400 seats in the House of Commons. But I really must emphasise here, this is a declaration of how voters who are certain to vote will vote. So what's happened since 2019 is a significant share of that Tory base, the Boris Johnson backing base, have indicated apathy. They now tell pollsters they're undecided. They're unsure of who they're going to go and vote for. That's normal in a midterm parliament, but we are now 6 weeks away from polling day. This is not a midterm parliament, is it? This is something quite different, quite unusual, I suppose. And we are seeing slightly in some polls the proportion of undecided voters go down, but we're not seeing Labour's lead go down. It seems as though the proportion of undecided voters is going down, but they are going to different parties. The share of support for reform is staying relatively the highest it's been, and the share of support for Labour is relatively as is. Not much is moving there. And again, if an election was held now, that would mean 400 seats for Labour, 150 something for the Conservatives, 30 for the Lib Dems, and 20 for the Scottish Nationalists, 1 for the Greens, and a few for Plaid Cymru. These numbers you're seeing in front of you, however, do not, I emphasise, they do not factor for tactical voting. Tactical voting is a reality in general elections. In a first-past-the-post democracy, you can't get away from it, and the only way forward with tactical voting is forward. It's only going to grow in breadth and place. Okay, the less tribal we as a country become, the more willing voters are to look for parties further afield. The influence of Nigel Farage, of the Leave vote, of the support for Scottish independence, and other such forces, of Boris Johnson as well, has led to voters thinking of themselves not as Labour voters or Tory voters or traditional voters, but more swing voters. I once wrote an article a few years ago calling us a nation of swingers, and that is indeed what we are. And what that means is it's not that elections become more unpredictable, rather that in certain races, tactical voting will play a greater role. The risk here is that on current numbers, if the polls do not change by polling day, and if you factor for tactical voting, which in 1997 meant around a few dozen seats switched hands, it would not be unreasonable to think that the Conservatives could fall as low as 100 seats. That would be the worst performance for the Conservative or Tory party in history. I say that again. If you factor for tactical voting on these numbers, you would be looking at the worst performance for the Conservative Party in its history. Okay, the Liberal Democrats would primarily be the biggest beneficiaries right now. Without tactical voting, they're on 30 seats. They could move up to around about 50. Labour could move up to around about 430, 440. And also, if you factor for tactical voting in Scotland, things could get very interesting indeed. Let's look at Scotland. So the polls have shifted quite substantially since the coronavirus crisis. Back then, the SNP were on 40 to 50%. And then, around about the time of the Holyrood election, they stayed stubbornly the same. It was SNP 48%, Conservative 22%, Labour 20%, Liberal Democrats 6%. And the Greens also were bringing up with around about 5 to 10% of support. And then the chaos in Scotland, in which Nicola Sturgeon's own reputation ended up being trashed, did see support for the SNP drift and decline. Note that support for the SNP started falling before the arrival of Liz Truss, before the surge for Labour nationally. Okay, so what's happening here is not just Liz Truss, it is SNP induced as well. The resignation of Liz Truss and the arrival of Humza Yousaf did not do much to stem the slippage in support for the SNP. They drifted from 45% at the start of 2023 to 35% at the end, and right now they are also still on 35%. But this compares to 34% for Labour, 17% for the Conservatives, and a very solid, static 7% for the Liberal Democrats there. Now, what would this mean in a general election? Well, we need to take into account the fact that tactical voting will have an effect. And the way Scotland votes tactically, or rather, the way Scottish tactical voters go, is not necessarily in the same way English tactical voters go. In Scotland, voters vote a little bit more on nationalist/unionist lines, or rather pro-independence and pro-union lines. What we've seen in council by-elections, in local elections, and indeed in British election study surveys is that a not insubstantial number of Scottish Tory voters are willing to lend their support to Labour. The same can be said for Scottish Labour voters to the Conservatives, but the scale of which is so much smaller than on the inverse. So unionist tactical voting, that could probably happen. Here's what the current numbers say. At the last election, the Scottish National Party had 47 MPs in the House of Commons, the Conservatives 6, Lib Dems 2, Labour 1. This, by the way, is based on the new boundaries and uses the notional results of Rallings and Thrasher. I did my own notional figures, but let's be honest here, I'm going to be using the numbers that get the most use. Now, the 2024 forecast, according to the Britain Predicts model, the new model not yet released, puts the Scottish National Party, the SNP, on 28 seats, down from 47. That is a decline in 19 seats. Labour become the biggest beneficiaries, rising from 1 to 24, and the Scottish Tories lose 4, falling down to 2, tying with the Liberal Democrats. But once you factor for tactical voting, once you factor for the fact that Unionist voters are a little bit more fluid in who they're willing to support to beat the Scottish National Party, then you find a slightly, or rather substantially, different electoral result. Instead of 28 SNP seats, you have 20. Instead of 24 Labour seats, you have 26. And instead of 2 Conservative seats, you have 6. And I note in the model spreadsheet I was looking at, the latest readings, it's not unreasonable to think that maybe the Conservatives could pick up even 1 more seat there from the SNP because of progressive tactical voting, or rather unionist tactical voting. Progressive tactical voting isn't as great in Scotland as it is in England, and that may be to the Conservatives' benefit. It isn't unreasonable, actually, to think most of Northern England will fall to Labour. But once you cross from Northumberland into Berwickshire and Dumfriesshire, you see some Conservatives holding on to their seats. The Conservatives will probably fail in Berwick, in Northumberland, and Penrith and the border, but they probably might hold on into Berwickshire. Something to bear in mind there. The Liberal Democrats could also benefit from tactical voting as well. Instead of winning 2, as presently forecast, they could end up winning 5. That is tactical voting. Now, I am a little bit incredulous, or a little bit shocked that we are having a general election in July. Because the impetus, it seems, is the inflation figures we've seen released today. The rate of inflation is down, but few are feeling it. So why on earth would you go to the polls? Well, they are, and it's happening. And I think we're all in a little bit of disbelief, aren't we? Nevertheless, here is what the British voter thinks. And at the New Statesman, we've been doing some polling with Redfield and Wilton, some exclusive polling, and it is month to month. I think we're only going to get 1 more month now, and nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. Sorry to sound like Theresa May there, but really nothing has changed. In March, few Britons think the UK is in a better state than it was in 2010. Same in April, same in May. Little has changed here. Most Britons, the vast majority of Britons, think this country has either not changed since 2010, when the Conservatives were calling this country Greece, and most say it's got worse. Vast majority of say it's got worse. Nothing has changed there. Now, let's finish up here. Labour's lead as they start the 2024 general election campaign is 21 percentage points over the Conservatives. That is substantial. That is large. I would note that it is not quite as large as what we were seeing for Labour in the 1997 election campaign, but I would then also make the argument that maybe polling has better form now than it did then. Maybe it's a little bit more accurate now. We don't know. We can't necessarily say with that much certainty. But the party lead, 21 points. The economy lead, 13 points. Starmer's lead over Sunak, 11 points. And Starmer's own likability, 2 points. That's all right. That should be more than enough to guarantee you a majority. This feels like a nailed-on win for Labour. If they do anything else, if they get a result anything other than a certain and substantial Labour win, they are doing something very wrong indeed. So the 4th of July is going to be polling day. It's going to be a very big day for this country. It feels like a slight almost to the Americans as they celebrate Independence Day, but it's coming. It's coming. Big Labour lead. I don't know what else you can say. Do you expect the polls to change? Will they change? Is there reason for them to change? On almost every other issue, the Labour Party have a lead over the Conservatives. Even according to some pollsters, Labour have a lead over the Conservatives on defence, on Ukraine, And these were the only two issues the Tories had a lead on. On every other issue, the Labour lead is almost without question. The main weaknesses for Labour are in Starmer's own image. Around about a quarter of Britons still don't really know what to think of him. He still has to set out his stall to the public. Are Britons ready to listen? Well, there's a hell of a lot of apathy out there. I reiterate once more, a lot of this poll lead for Labour, this 21-point poll lead, is a consequence of 2019 Boris Johnson backers unsure of how they're going to vote. Okay? Now, I expect it to narrow. I think a lot of people expect it to narrow because I think few of us can necessarily appreciate or properly grasp the idea that Labour's going to win so big. But I would just say it loudly. This is not a presidential country. This isn't a country that votes purely on personality. It's changing. The votes in the mayoral races, Ben Houchen's hold in the Tees Valley or Teesdale is testament to the fact that we are becoming more presidential, that we are focusing more, on governor personalities like they do in the States. But it's not absolute, is it? The fact we have the very popular Andy Street losing in the West Midlands, admittedly, yes, a very traditional Labour part of the world, but losing there is evidence enough that party popularity does still matter. We are not a country that is presidential. Going hard on Keir Starmer might deal you some dividends, but it won't win you or change the whole arithmetic. Labour's lead is at 21 points. Labour's lead on the economy is at 13 points. How do you move on from that? How, rather, when the country, or 6 in 10 of us, 7 in 10 of us, tell Ipsos, the pollster, that the next election should be a change election, the next election should be the election in which we have a change of government, how do you, as an incumbent administration, get past that? I don't think you do you? My name has been Ben Walker. I am the co-founder of Britain Elects. I'm a senior data journalist at the New Statesman. This is the first of maybe many broadcasts that we're going to be doing as the election campaign unfolds. I need to go and clean my house now. I need to go and do some shopping. But I wasn't expecting this 4th of July general election. I suspect a lot of us weren't. I couldn't actually accept the idea that it was going to happen because it felt like such a silly time to have it. You would either go as soon as you possibly can, early as you can, or you would have waited till the last minute, November, December, January. This feels, it's a brave move by Rishi Sunak, but how many colleagues is it going to cost? We'll be taking a look at that in another video. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you follow Britain Elects on Twitter. Be sure to also subscribe to the YouTube, youtube.com/@Britain Elects. Keep an eye on my socials. I am at BNH Walker. The campaign has begun. Oh my God. We're not going to get any sleep, are we? So yeah. Thank you very much for watching. Have a good evening. See you another time. Bye-bye.